Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Trisha Edwards, the Deputy Director of Smithsonian Affiliations, and I'm so glad to have you all with us today. We are pleased to welcome you to our program, Space, the Final Frontier. As we get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from land that once belonged to the Piscataway and Pamunkey. We honor these and other native lands and appreciate the continued stewardship of them by Indigenous communities. In our program today, we explore the many connections between Westerns and spaceflight through some of our speakers' favorite objects, toys. Toys are beloved belongings, often treasured and meaningful to us far beyond childhood. There are toys in every museum of the Smithsonian, and tonight we're looking forward to learning about some of those in the National Air and Space Museum and what they can tell us about history. I'm looking forward to our conversation. We would like to thank our affiliate partner, the Arizona Historical Society, whose exhibition, Ready to Launch, Arizona's Place in Space, on view at the Arizona History Museum in Tucson, inspired this program. We're happy to have Shannon Fleischman, curator at the Arizona Historical Society, with us tonight to share a few words about the project. Shannon, can you tell us a little bit about where the idea for this exhibition came from?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm so excited that you all are here. Just a little bit about the exhibit at the Arizona History Museum in Tucson. The idea came from, I grew up in Arizona, grew up in northern Arizona, going to field trips to Lowell's Observatory, where Pluto was discovered, going to Meteor Crater, and then on school field trips. And then I attended the University of Arizona when we were helping put a Mars rover on Mars. So I grew up knowing the significance that Arizona played in space exploration. And so this exhibit is really my love letter to Arizona and the importance that often gets overlooked. Everyone knows that Houston and Florida have a huge impact on the space program, but not everybody knows that all of the Apollo astronauts actually trained in Flagstaff in order to get the samples that we have from the moon. So you'll see Buzz Aldrin's spacesuit in our exhibit and a couple of other really exciting objects, including the Pluto plates, where the first photographs of Pluto can be seen. So make sure you come down and see it before it closes on November 30th this year. Back to you.
Thank you, Shannon. And thanks for sharing that personal connection. I think it's always wonderful to hear how just our colleagues get into this field and how our personal perspectives influence our work. So if you're in Tucson, please be sure to go visit to learn about the unique role Arizona has played in the American space program. And if you're not able to visit one of the locations of the Arizona Historical Society, please visit a Smithsonian affiliate in your area. We'll post a link here in the chat where you can find the one closest to you. Before we get into the program, we have just a few housekeeping items. First of all, we sincerely apologize. We had planned to have this program closed caption. We've had some technical issues and the captioning is not going to be live for this evening. So again, we sincerely apologize. We do our best to strive for accessibility in all that we do. But we will have the recording of this program captioned and on our YouTube page in the coming days. And I also sincerely apologize that my dog has chosen this moment to bark. So apologies if you're hearing that in the background. As I mentioned, this program is being recorded and we will post the link soon, and we'll send a link to everyone who registered so that you can share it and enjoy it again. If you have comments, please use the chat box, as I see many of you are already doing. It's wonderful to see a robust conversation already and seeing where you're all from. If you have questions for our presenters, please enter those in the Q&A box, which you can see in the toolbar of your Zoom screen, and we'll be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A. And please note that while on-topic discussion is encouraged, we ask that you express yourself in a civil manner and treat others with respect. The Smithsonian monitors comments and may remove participants from the program in accordance with its terms of use. And we'll post a link to the Smithsonian's terms in the chat for your reference. If you have a technical issue or a question unrelated to today's discussion, please use the raise your hand feature or type it in the chat box and a Smithsonian staff member will assist you. At Smithsonian Affiliations, we partner with museums and cultural organizations across the country to support them and their communities, people like all of you joining us today, while also furthering the Smithsonian's mission, the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Like the Smithsonian, our affiliate partners are committed to education and public service and work in collaboration with the Smithsonian to catalyze critical conversations in their communities and help us all better understand the world around us. Today's program is a great example of the ways in which the Smithsonian and our affiliates work together to bring thought-provoking, relevant, and sometimes entertaining content to audiences like you. With the help of affiliate organizations from California to Massachusetts, Tennessee to Oregon, and of course, Arizona, we're able to bring this program to communities across the nation and prompt thought and conversation with audiences near and far. I will moderate today's discussion, and I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Margaret Weitekamp, Chair of the Space History Department at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. In addition to serving as the department chair, Dr. Weitekamp also curates the museum's social and cultural history of spaceflight collection with more than 5,000 artifacts that include space memorabilia and space science fiction objects, which sounds like one of the best jobs on the planet. These everyday mementos of the space age, which include toys and games, medals and awards, buttons and pins, as well as comics and trading cards, complete the story about spaceflight told by the museum's collection of space hardware and technology. Now, I am delighted to turn it over to Margaret.
Thank you very much, Tricia. And thank you to Tricia's dog for making me feel less self-conscious about the possibility that my dogs or children may run into the screen. I think that we're all set. Thank you to Smithsonian Affiliations. I'm really delighted to be here tonight, and welcome to all of you. It's lovely to see how far flung this is. It's really a treat to get to bring this to you. So I will say that you come to the Smithsonian for original research, and I will admit right off the bat that this is not an original title. I have chosen this because, and this idea is not new. President John F. Kennedy called space the new frontier when he dedicated the United States to a lunar landing before the decade was out in the 1960s. He called his compatriots, those who were working with him, new frontiersmen. That's what they called themselves. And obviously, this is the first line of the iconic opening monologue from the original Star Trek television series that aired on NBC from 1966 to 1969. Now, this frontier metaphor has evoked strong reactions in ways that have been inspiring, but also sometimes problematic. And so what I want to do today is really talk about the relationship between American space science fiction and the Western in ways that may be obvious, and in some ways that I hope that you might not have thought about before. So I'm beginning with this phrase, the final frontier, in part because the museum holds the 11-foot studio model of the Star Trek Starship Enterprise that was used to film that original television series in the 1960s. Now, this was conserved and put on display in the Boeing Milestones of Flight Hall in 2016. And it is currently off display as we're doing this massive renovation in the building on the National Mall. But it will be coming back by the end of 2022.
Margaret, I just want to, I'm sorry to bump in. We're actually not seeing slides.
All right. So let me, because there was a cute one, and hang on, let me make sure that
I know.
am doing what I need to do. So I'm so glad that you said something. And hang on just a second. I'm going to pop you up, and I'm going to do, there we go. Now, are you seeing slides?
We are. Thank you.
Ta-da! There we go. Apologies, and I'm so glad you said something. So, Star Trek, we have the original 11-foot studio model of the Star Trek Starship Enterprise. It is in the Boeing Milestones of Flight Hall, and that is an object that I work with a lot. But today's talk really began with essentially a problem that came. We're one museum, two sites. So we have the museum on the National Mall, which you see pictured on your upper left, and on your lower right, you're seeing the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, which is the museum's second site out by Dulles Airport. And I was working there to set up a case of space science fiction toys. And it really struck me as I was looking through the collection that the museum's collection of space science fiction objects has a large variety of toy ray guns. So here in the front, you've got one from Flash Gordon. Back left, the white one is a laser gun from 1960, a space jet toy that dates from the late 40s, early 50s, and from the mid 1930s, 1936, we've got a Buck Rogers that's actually a water gun, the yellow and orange one that's on the far right here. So the question then, all kinds of shapes, sizes, colors, configurations. But why do space science fiction stories feature handguns? Why are there rocket pistols and blasters and phasers so prominently in this genre? And the more I started to think about this, the more I really came back to this, which is Buck Rogers. So Buck Rogers began as a comic strip in 1928, and it really took off. And by the 1930s, there were it was a Sunday comic. There were comic books. There were big little books like the one that you see pictured here. There was a series of movie serials that were done, playing Buster Crabbe, holding the gun there as Buck Rogers. And so some of the very first toy ray guns were made to go with the Buck Rogers comic strips in the 1930s. And I would argue, the more I've looked at this, that Buck Rogers really in some fundamental ways shapes the archetype of the American space science fiction in ways that I think people have noticed, but not always fully explored. And the more I looked at this, the more I was really thinking about the ways that Americans have for years defined themselves as distinctive because of this gunslinger heritage that comes out of the American frontier myth. So I'm looking at the ways that the American Western and American space science fiction has a lot in common. And they say a lot about Americans' ideas about themselves. And you can see that in this series of images ranging from the left from Gary Cooper to, again, Buster Crabbe with his sidekick as Buck Rogers, obviously Clint Eastwood from the Sergio Leone, Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and then Harrison Ford here as Han Solo from the Star Wars films and franchise. So I'm going to take a minute here and do a bit of American studies, American history, and this parallel between the genres is, I believe, are really rooted in American beliefs about the frontier. And one of the places that that coalesces is in what is called the Frontier Thesis that was advanced by Frederick Jackson Turner. So now he's an historian. He presents a paper at the AHA, the American Historical Association annual meeting, the biggest meeting of historians, in 1893. And he's looking at the centrality of the frontier for American identity. And what he's thinking about is that according to the 1890 census, just 3 years earlier, the frontier had closed. There was no more unexplored, unsettled land in the continuous United States, which was all of the United States in 1893. And so he argues then that the frontier shaped American identity in a really fundamental way. That dynamic of the frontier, the meeting of the wilderness and civilization, creates a unique American character of citizens who were hardy enough to beat back or civilize the wilderness, and yet shaped by this fortifying experience of the frontier. This gains great prominence in many ways because it really draws on these kind of bigger stories, kind of foundational ideas about the United States, about American exceptionalism, about what makes the nation different and unique. And one of those ideas was that the United States would be able to escape old world problems because of available land. So the inheritance laws that said that all land has to be inherited in whole by the first son, primogeniture and entail, that doesn't really apply here because look how much space there is. So Thomas Jefferson, for instance, believed with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 that he had purchased an empire for liberty, is what he called it. He thought that it would take 100 generations for Americans to fill all of that space. And this idea of manifest destiny is also that Americans were somehow divinely destined to fill the continent in that way. Now, there's obvious gaps in this set of ideas that I hope you can already see. The assumption that this is somehow empty space or for the taking or divinely for white Europeans to lead. But that is a set of ideas that really become in some ways fundamental. And as a result, Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis about American character really taps into this larger basis. And around that same time, around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, with the closing of that frontier, you have the beginnings of the mythologizing of that frontier. So you have a book like Owen Wister's The Virginian, which was published in 1902, and it's not the very first Western, but it's the first cowboy novel, cowboy as a literary hero. And this is a love story set in a Wyoming ranching town. Hanging is the punishment for horse thievery. And this is a story of a hero with rough edges who has come obviously from the East. He is the Virginian who is heading into the West and falls in love with a proper school teacher, conflict with a truly black-hatted villain. And it really starts to set some of the archetypes for the Western as a type in this cowboy novel. And I would argue that then as we kind of come forward into the 20th century and into the 1920s and 30s, those literary and popular culture forms start to blend into each other and feed into each other. So American Westerns and American space science fiction have a lot in common. So on the left here, we have the poster for the 1929 film of The Virginian starring Gary Cooper. And on the right, a 1939 advertisement for Buck Rogers, that film serial that I was talking about, a series of films that would have been shown in theaters over a course of weeks, little short pieces. Tune in next week, come back to the theater, pay your quarter, and you can see the next installment along with the main feature and the cartoons and the newsreel. And this starts Buster Crabbe. And there are really some very common elements here. That core cast starring a hero with a sidekick who's often youthful, an older kind of avuncular advisor, the love interest with moxie and yet a disturbing tendency to be kidnapped. And together that core cast then is often paired with a kind of a named steed. In the Western, you knew not only the name of the cowboy, but the name of his horse. In the space science fiction, the ship tends to have a name and almost a personality. And they are heading off for adventure, often at the point of a gun. And that brings me back to these toys, which is that when you take so much form in American space science fiction, especially as Buck Rogers starts, based on the Western, then you end up with this rocket pistol at the center of it. So the one on the top right hand is the XZ-31 rocket pistol from 1934. That is made by Daisy Manufacturing Company of Plymouth, Michigan. And it is such a successful toy in the Christmas time of 1934 that there actually becomes a price war between Macy's and Gimbel's, two of the biggest department stores in the country at the time, as they're trying to undercut each other and attract buyers to this wildly popular toy. Now, the one in the front, directly in front of you, is the smaller version of that. That's the Wilma Deering gun. That's the girl's gun that is made the next year, 1935. And the one up on the top left is a kind of movie model that we also acquired at the museum. But looking at these toys started making me think about, there's a lot of literature about popular culture and how things are used. There's a deeply theoretical literature about things, Heideggerian ideas of things. I won't go too far into the Heidegger. And the idea of scripted actions, that when you take a thing in your hands, it somewhat scripts, doesn't define what you're going to do, but offers some parameters, the way that an actor might take a script and interpret it in his or her own way, but the script provides some bounds. I think that's a very kind of sophisticated theoretical backing for what many of us know if you have kids, with just thinking about a toy and the point of view that it offers when you're playing with that toy. So one would notice, for instance, that there's a toy created to hold and to be Buck Rogers. There's a toy created then to hold and be Wilma Deering. And if we're going to switch the franchises to Flash Gordon, which is created as a kind of imitator comic that comes a few years after Buck Rogers, with a very similar set of toys, what you start thinking about is, who are you not when you play with this toy? Which is, you're not the villain, right? So when we look at Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, they play with this form from the Western of the kind of unequivocal hero who is fighting a dastardly villain. And in this case, the dastardly villain comes with a lot of the everyday racism of the time. So Flash Gordon is fighting Ming the Merciless, the leader of Planet Mungo. Buck Rogers is fighting the Mongol hordes in the initial stories, as well as gangster Killer Kane in some of the movie serials. But these are very much a part of their time. And I think it's striking that when you look at these toys, the toys do not offer any opportunity to step into the villain's alien or non-white shoes. And it does make you, I think and look in different ways at what counts as alien. So in this tableau, which comes from the Flash Gordon serials, we have, again, Buster Crabbe played both Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers in the 1930s, and had his hair bleached very, very blonde for those roles. And you'll notice that Charles Middleton, who was a white man, but is dressed with this Fu Manchu mustache, very deliberately drawing on this very Asiatic look for this kind of Asian supervillain. But then his daughter here on the left is Priscilla Larson as Princess Aura. And in this case, just being brunette is enough to mark one as alien, as other. And you see that played out then in the toys. So if we stay in this Flash Gordon universe, looking at the depictions over time of the despot leader of Planet Mungo and the enemy of Flash Gordon, you can really see this reflection then of the anti-Asian sentiment of the 1930s in this choice of a stereotypical Asian supervillain. Now, when we jump forward into the 1950s to a show like Space Patrol, which is a bit of a space procedural on television that aired on ABC from 1950 to 1955. It started as a local show in Los Angeles and then went national. You see that the toy, in many ways, really echoes the translation of a Western fort into a kind of space fort. And in terms of the toy maker, I suspect that they took their Western fort and changed the lithography on the metal pieces that create the fence around, as well as, and then peopled it with, all of these little figures and accessories. And this is a part of what would be fun about a set like this. But it's very much a set of extruded plastic pieces that are astronauts and aliens who can fight each other, echoes of what, again, in the kind of casual racism of the time, would have been the cowboys versus Indians that you would have played with at the time. And I think in some ways an echo of a Cold War us versus them mindset. The idea of, unequivocal heroes and dastardly villains is, I think, reflected very much here. In some ways, I think other scholars haven't spent a lot of time looking at the kind of Americanness of the Western and space science fiction and how they're layered onto each other, because it's been exported so often. So it is really critical to American identity and reflections of American culture, but it's certainly not in isolation. And so there's important cross-pollination between Japanese films, for instance, Kurosawa in the 1950s, and American Westerns, such as The Seven Samurai in 54 or The Magnificent Seven in 1960. And here we have, again, this still from the Italian-made Westerns in the 1960s known as spaghetti Westerns. And this is Clint Eastwood in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, directed by Sergio Leone. And so we see some of that kind of cross-pollination between the cultural forms. If the gunslinger in the frontier context is clear in the 1930s space science fiction, it's equally so in the 1960s. So the creator of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, pitched Star Trek initially as Wagon Train to the Stars. That was the idea, a kind of self-contained ship carrying a crew heading out into space. And I think we can see some parts of that Buck Rogers archetype here with Captain Kirk, played by William Shatner, as our hero. And then the complement there where Roddenberry is deliberately playing against some of what are the expectations are to create a crew of men and women going into space together, even with Leonard Nimoy here on the left, playing Mr. Spock, a half Vulcan, half human. And we see this played out then in the play set that you get with this. This is the Migo playset that it becomes available after the original television series. It's kind of around the same moment as the animated series comes out. And ours here that you see pictured is actually on loan from one of our staff, and I've yet to been able to convince him to give it to the Smithsonian. But if you see our stuff well painted, it is because Dave Wilson has gotten the paint right, and he is also the supplier of this piece. So this gunslinger image really continues in American science fiction, and you see that I have posters here and stills from Star Wars from 1977, George Lucas's film, but really we know that that universe becomes a trilogy and a trilogy of trilogies, and this, in many ways, Lucas was explicitly a fan of classic Westerns. And both of these male leads are really, in some ways, playing on some of the archetypes. And so, again, I don't have to work very hard in looking for images to find this focus on guns, whether it's the original movie poster or publicity stills or stills from the film itself. But when you look at the toys for these, I think you can see ones like these action figures from Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. And there was a kind of shift as we think of our point of view in our perspective again. So this is a place where by the 1970s, these are being marketed in a couple of ways. One, to appeal to both boys and girls. Our selection here has mostly the boy figures, but the prominence of Princess Leia as a figure and with the marketing of this was very important. And they talked explicitly in the making of the toys about the fact that they wanted these to appeal to both boys and girls. And it's also a way that you see the beginnings of the kind of collector's market. So we have pictured here not only the action figures, but the carrying case. And if any of you had one of these, you can raise your hand to yourself, but you know that the little places inside had a label that would say what action figure fit into what slot. So of course you needed all of the action figures that would fit in the right slots. And the card backs on these action figures then again encourage you to collect these widely and start to kind of break out and play with some of the archetype of who that core cast is. Now, one of the places we see a big shift is in with the 1990s. And I start with the idea that we've really got new scholars. Patricia Limerick, who's a historian of the American West, people like Richard Slotkin, Native American scholars of Native America, like Daniel Richter, who are really looking at the ways that that frontier myth flattens out and oversimplifies a lot of really complex history. This is not an unoccupied West. The idea of the West is only as a projection of Easterners' ideas of the West rather than those who actually lived in the West. And they start to really argue that it's not about being on the frontier or the frontier as some line of civilization sweeping west, but about being in the frontier, understanding this as a region of exchange, a place where cultures are meeting and mixing. And I think you start to see that in the science fiction that comes at the time. So if you've watched J. Michael Straczynski's 5-season series, Babylon 5, or the series that was pitched at the same time, Deep Space Nine in the Star Trek universe, these are both shows that are set on space stations and that really see this kind of frontier setting as a crossroads where different cultures mix, mingle, have conflict, but also are really, forced to coexist. And I think there are important ways that you see the fiction echoing some of the cultural conversations that are happening in museums. There's a rather controversial exhibit at the Smithsonian, The West as America, where this is part of a broader conversation about understanding how to live in a diverse society. And I think that part of what's fascinating for me with this is the way that, again, you see it reflected in the toys. So one of the things that we were able to collect in a collection of Babylon 5 memorabilia was a set, and we've got a couple of these. You can see they're created as limited edition collector's series, so kind of building on the collector's market that had started with Star Wars toys and the ways that people were looking to complete sets or to trade those. I think part of what's striking here is on the left here, you've got Captain Sheridan, who is the white captain, the male, the kind of stereotypical figure as the lead in the series. But on the right hand, you have the alien figure, Jakar, being presented in the same presentation, being presented in the same way. And I think that that reflects the ways that the series actually brought the alien characters were not the other, they were not the villain, they were dealing in a more complex moral universe, but they were also really trying to deal with difference as something that would be embraced, as something that would be sympathetic, and also that not a kind of everybody gets along, but a dealing with, what does this real difference mean, and being able occasionally to see through the alien's eyes. So if we think about the point of view that we had with our Buck Rogers rocket pistol from 1934, and we jump here to this figure of Jakar that's offered as an equal in the collector's universe to the white male hero, and that in the course of the show was presented as a very sympathetic character that became in fact a fan favorite. I think you begin to see some of the ways that this Western archetype has in its power its ability to shift and remold and respond to cultural changes. And that, I think, is really important. So that's some of the thought that came out of my beginning to think about what do I do about all these toy ray guns, and what are the things that came out of that. So there are a few different results of this work at the museum and in my own work. So one was I did in fact create the space science fiction toys case out at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. This is a glimpse of the end of one of the case on the left, where you see we have a couple of Barbies, we have a Captain Video board game, we have a series of Japanese tin toys at the top that kind of bridge the robot astronaut, and also some of our Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon toys that you can see pictured on the right with a museum label. It's probably a little longer than it should be, but it's got a lot of good information. I also then worked with our exhibit designer to create a really visually interesting display of the toy ray guns. I wanted them to kind of be up there to demonstrate the array of colors and shapes and differences in technologies that are imagined, and then to try to explicitly draw that parallel with American Westerns, and so to have them all kind of pointing inward at my label, which tells you about this relationship between space science fiction and the Western, and why it is that the handgun, the phaser, the blaster, the ray gun, the laser gun is such an iconic part of all of that. So that case came together very well. And if you come to the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, you can see that on display in the McDonnell Space Hangar. We've also worked with other collecting. So one of the images we used to advertise this talk, the movie Toy Story from 1995, again, I think features some of the links between the Western and space imagination and the way that those two imaginaries exist side by side and intertwined. This is a Buzz Light on the right-hand side is a Buzz Lightyear toy that actually flew to the International Space Station in 2008. It was part of an educational initiative that NASA did. They worked with Disney Pixar as a part of a broader Toys in Space project. They've sent Slinkies and all kinds of balls and fidget spinners into space to do demonstrations for school children about physics in space. And so this Buzz Lightyear toy actually flew aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery, which is also at the museum, twice, up on STS-124 and down on STS-128. And this picture in the inset is Pat Forrester, who was the pilot and commander of STS-128, who, after they buttoned everything up, they realized they needed to do a few more orbits before some weather would clear and they would be able to land. And people remembered, hey, wait a minute, don't we have Buzz Lightyear on here? And one of the great things about artifact toys as artifacts is people, even very, very serious astronauts, and Pat Forrester is a very serious astronaut, cannot resist playing with a toy if one is on hand. And so it's one of the things that I think makes these kinds of subjects, while they can be, very sophisticated and intellectual in how they're framed and analyzed, also an awful lot of fun to bring to the public and to have on display, because I think there's a sense of being able to get your hands on it and get your hands around it and have some sense of what we're talking about. So my last piece on this is I'm finishing a book that I'm calling Space Craze that I hope to have out next fall, that will basically start with the kinds of arguments that I've put out here today. And that I hope through this talk and with the book next year will give you some new ways to think about space, the final frontier. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. That was awesome. And it was just so interesting, but I just love this image in particular. It's really wonderful. So please, we have a few questions we're going to start with, but please continue to post comments in the chat or questions in the Q&A. There is an interesting comment early in the in your talk, Margaret, that someone commented on how it was an image of from space, but how much the character's belt buckle looked, how Western the belt buckle looked. That even though it was very clearly a spacesuit, there was this element of sort of a nod to the Western.
I think that's true. I think that you definitely see that in the costuming and how things are thought about. And one of the pieces that I'm very excited to have brought into the collection, and we are still working out exactly where that's going to be displayed in the new iteration, is one of my colleagues, David Devorkin, who just retired after 40 years as the historian of astronomy. Himself, every day at work, wore his Space Patrol belt buckle that he got when he was a kid in LA in the 1950s. And was a early fan of the Space Patrol television program. And so we had some wonderful family pictures of him and his brother, but very clearly with him with his big kind of Western style, yet space themed belt buckle. And upon his retirement, I was delighted to bring that into the collection.
Wonderful. So let me start with some of the questions we have. Can you speak to how the frontier symbology also appeared in the actual space program, like the prevalence of Columbia?
Yes. So I think it's one of the things that when you start to draw on the kind of American symbols, in many ways, you start to draw on Western symbols of the West, or symbols formed and that become iconic in the Western. And so, Reagan certainly was fan of the kind of, of being associated with space flight, but also very comfortable in a cowboy hat and on horseback. I think you see places where people have been very interested in that kind of crossover, and you see that somewhat in the ways that some names are chosen, things like that. So yes, the more you pull this thread, I think the more examples you get.
Rebecca asks an interesting question. She says, I was really struck by your comment about the notion of otherness and its display in art. And I was wondering what you thought about similar displays of otherness from the lens of disability studies, such as in shows like The Twilight Zone, when Martians and Venetians are marked as other by the physical manifestation of a third eye or a third hand.
I think that when you look at popular culture, television, film, and you start to do those analyses, one of the first things that you start thinking about is kind of who's the us and who's the them, and what's the gaze of the camera and what's the assumptions about who's in and who's out and what's the other. And I think that part of what's striking then when you go back in the 1930s is that you're able to say, you know, the brunette is the other, is, you know, because we're so going to form the vision of the hero as aggressively blonde, blue-eyed, white male, able-bodied, you know, capable, leaping over things. So I think it's one of the places, though, where science fiction has been extraordinarily strong in playing with that and thinking about what it means to be alien, what it means to be other, and then what it means to bring that back in. And I think if you are, you know, a Star Trek fan and you're watching some of the more current series that they have, you see that they have actors who use wheelchairs who have been cast in either background or also prominent roles. That they have been playing around with by casting characters who are non-binary, and who then, you know, the other characters get to do a little kind of masterclass on how to use non-gender specific pronouns to refer to them throughout the whole scene, and it just makes perfect sense. So I think that science fiction, by defamiliarizing, by setting things in this kind of alien world that looks like ours but not quite, gives us a little bit of narrative distance to be able to see things a little bit more clearly. And so one of the strongest things that science fiction often does is try to take contemporary political, social issues and show them to us on another planet, on another spaceship, and then we get a fresher look at them.
Yeah, so interesting. There's a related question also in the chat from Valerie, who asks, are there any analogs in space science fiction of the stereotypical good and bad women as you see in Westerns, like this good school marm and the woman of ill repute?
Very much so. I think Star Trek, original Star Trek, is a great place to see that. There's all kinds of you know, it's kind of classic sirens who are female characters who are a little bit dangerous, but then we also have the, you know, characters of Nurse Chapel or Lieutenant Uhura, who are a part of our kind of core cast and who are a part of the complement. So I do think that you start to that you see that kind of casting of women, and it's interesting that it's in more recent series where there's a little more narrative space, and I think it probably also comes from having more women in the writers' room, to create female characters that can have a relationship and still have their own personality and do things, and don't just have to be the girlfriend or the wife, or the femme fatale, the, you know, the dangerous seductress. So the complexity of some of the female characters has really, you know, since the 1990s, really developed in interesting ways.
Yeah, and I would imagine that you sort of see the same pattern that you see in other types of entertainment, following that same path, as you mentioned, as more women become writers, as our conversation around these issues changes. So interesting.
Right. This certainly isn't a science fiction only conversation. Right. It's a part of the broader cultural one, and I think it's an interesting way to see it distilled and be able to examine it.
Yeah, and I think to your point earlier about, well, we put this on this other planet in this sort of foreign to us environment, I think it can I don't know. I wonder if it's both sometimes easier to deal with those issues there because it's not like where we are, but also if it magnifies those issues or makes us more aware of some of those dynamics.
I think so. And those are some of the really deliberate tactics used in science fiction, right? The extrapolation from a current issue to something, what might it look like if this carried on for generations, the defamiliarization of taking something and setting it in another world. I draw a lot on Star Trek because it's a place that I've done a lot of study. There was a great episode in the original series, Let This Be Our Last Battlefield. I always get the title slightly wrong. Someone in the comments will correct me. But they come upon a planet that's half white and half black, and half black and half white. And of course, those folks don't get along. And as viewers, we see, what's wrong with them? Like, they're clearly not that different. They're just mirrors of each other. And in 1967, 1968, that's a profound conversation to be having about race relations. Can't you see how similar you are?
Right. Barry is asking about foreign science fiction. Has foreign science fiction of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, it just disappeared from me. Hold on just a second. Reflected the has foreign science fiction of the 40s, 50s, and 60s reflected the frontier theme in line with the American view?
So I think that's part of what is interesting to me is there's been a lot of really good historical scholarly work done recently, looking at the Russian roots of the Soviet and Russian space program, for instance, culturally Russian, not Soviet politically, but and looking at cosmism, which is, a Russian view and really rooted in some kind of transcendental and religiously based ideas, and how that influenced the ways that the Soviet space program was developed. There's excellent work that's been done on European astroculture by a colleague named Alexander Geppert, who's led a whole group of scholars who are working on that. And I read an excellent piece on Korean science fiction recently by a Harvard professor who was noticing that Korean culture is very rooted in the land, in the connection of the people to the land. And in Korean science fiction, they don't tend to go anywhere. They end up in a future Korea or an alternate Korea, but the Koreans stay connected to the land. And it was one of the things that made me start thinking about this kind of how American this form is that we've gotten used to. Because the first thing that happens in American space science fiction is you get on your ship and you go somewhere else, right? It's never about staying where you are. It is, you get on your horse and go. And that's part of the thing that really made me start unpacking the ways that it's so ubiquitous. Americans export so much popular culture, so many movies, television, things like that are consumed around the world that in some ways, I don't know that we've always unpacked what its content is and how it reflects these kind of American myths and national values as something that's American. In some ways, there have been places where scholars have dug into that in very specific ways, how 1950s television helped to launch the space age, for instance. But trying to take that broader look at it is not necessarily something that's been unpacked in that way.
Thanks. David is asking about the portrayal of robots and computers, if you can speak to that. And are there any analogs in the Western, in Westerns?
Oh, that's a great question, because I don't have a good answer for it. And there's always some question I don't have a good answer for. Certainly it is a key part of, it's often kind of the youth. This is something I need to think more about. Yes, there's computers. The idea of some sort of assistant, some sort of helpmate to the core crew is a core part of space science fiction. And it's something that really comes in 60s, 70s. Folks in the chat can correct me if you've got earlier examples. I'm thinking of like Twiki from Battlestar Galactica. I'm thinking of HAL, the computer from 2001, A Space Odyssey, R2-D2 and C-3PO, obviously, is the kind of main characters. My kids for years called that the robot movie because they understood you start with the robots and you end with the robots. That's the robot movie. thinking about the ways that that kind of a character would be a helpmate has also been something that we see in actual space exploration, attempts to invent that, create that, to make that happen for real astronauts.
Great. So
Lost in Space, yes, Robbie the Robot, I saw that in the comments,
yeah,
yes. Mid
yeah.
50s, yes, thank you. Oh, and yep, Danger Will Robinson from, so Lost in
Yeah.
Space, and then also Doctor Who.
And then we also, Valerie is saying, would Tonto be a sort of assistant to the Lone Ranger, comparable to a later robot assistant?
Ooh,
I think that's
interesting,
interesting.
deep, and problematic.
Yes.
Okay. This is part of what's fun about talking about this kind of stuff, is you never walk into a room where you're the one who knows the most, right? That, as much as I can kind of put some framing on this and, think about this thing through objects, part of what's fun with working with popular culture as a subject is you always walk into a room where people kind of know a lot about the stuff, and then they can ask you really good questions and play a good game of Stump the Curator.
Yeah. Jeff is saying it might be interesting to examine robot imagery versus the African American experience in post-Civil War West. That's super interesting.
Yes. Well, and we do have things like Rosie and the Jetsons, which is in some ways, I just saw a very good scholarly article that looked at the way Rosie is both figured and treated and talked about, echoes very much the mammy stereotype that you would see for African American women in popular culture, dating from things like Gone with the Wind. There are some interesting parallels there, and there are real ways in which, I think one of the things that we see in the speculative fiction in the 50s and 60s is they can picture lots of people going into space. They can't picture any way to get photographs back other than film, physically hand carried by a person. They can't picture computers necessarily smaller than a room. And so the idea of the kind of robotic exploration that's being done on the Martian surface right now, or that the kind of reconnaissance that's being done on a daily basis for weather, for all kinds of things from space, that was not necessarily a part of what was envisioned in those kind of classic speculative science fiction pieces in the 1950s. So there's some interesting blind spots in the way that that vision was put together.
Yeah, Shannon is noting in the chat, she said in actual space exploration, robots are leading the uncrewed missions on Mars and to meteors. So it's sort of this flip of the way we might think of, in long ago, we might have thought of them as sidekicks or helpers, but now they're actually leading the way.
Well, and interesting extensions of the human, right? So that when we have a mast that goes up that has the stereoscopic cameras, right? They tend to be mounted at about human height and about, we know how to see how we know how to see. And we then replicate that in some ways in the ways that we put our robotic extensions of ourselves together.
We also have a question about your perspective on Firefly, which is set on the edge between space and Westerns. And wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Right, Joss Whedon rides right on that line with Firefly, which was a short-lived science fiction show that very deliberately brought in kind of Western mannerisms, but also some interesting bits of cross-cultural speculation about the way that humanity would be living as a spacefaring species, where Chinese is also a common tongue, and in fact allows them to then swear on screen without the censors giving them trouble because they put all of those lines into Chinese. So I really enjoyed it. It's a great show, and it's interesting to see places where some of these franchises have really continued, right? So we just saw a 55th anniversary for the Star Trek universe. Star Wars is still very active. Babylon 5, it was just tweeted out that J. Michael Straczynski is working on a reboot of Babylon 5. So I'm interested to see what that will look like, because he's talking explicitly about thinking about what kinds of storytelling would he want to do with that worldview, with that set of characters, if he now knew what he now knows and would have at his disposal what he would now have at his disposal. That used some very early computer generated imaging, and that obviously is a very sophisticated set of tools right now that was in its infancy when he was working with it in the 1990s. So there were some, Firefly is a great show, highly recommended if you haven't seen it, good watching, and very much having a lot of fun right on that line between the Western and the science fiction.
So we've got a couple more minutes before we are at the hour. I want to shift a little bit now to the objects that we have in the Air and Space collections. And one of our guests is asking if there have been any space toys donated to the Smithsonian by astronauts or actors who have played astronauts.
Oh, nothing that's jumping to mind. I'm sure that someone can correct me in the chat if I've missed something. We do know, the Apollo astronauts who tended to be born in 1930 or the early 1930s in order to be at the right point of their careers to be going to the moon in the late 1960s, grew up watching Buck Rogers, reading Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon and playing with those kinds of toys. We're now seeing more astronauts who are going into space who grew up as Star Wars kids with all of those action figures, or who grew up with Star Trek. One of the other relationships that I haven't talked about, because it doesn't fit into my nice little motif about the Western, is Snoopy. And Charles Schultz was very generous in allowing NASA to use the Snoopy as a character. The Silver Snoopy is an award. It's a pin that is given by the astronauts themselves to recognize internally someone working for NASA or for a supporting company, that says that the astronauts who have flown have recognized that that person's contributions made them safer, allowed them to do their job. So that is a really prized thing, to get a Silver Snoopy. And so that's one of the places where we do also see, if you see toys, sometimes it's science fiction, but sometimes it's also Peanuts and Snoopy.
And I'm curious to know if there's anything that you have your eye on to collect, like anything that's not in the collection that you really want to bring in.
So I've been working with my colleague, Matt Schindel, who himself is a product of Arizona State, and who is our planetary science curator and a fan of science fiction. And so we've been thinking about The Expanse and the ways that we can bring some representation of that television show and that vision of kind of Earth belters and Mars and the kind of larger populated solar system into the collection. I've also been working with Matt and thinking about Halo, about computer gaming and the ways that computer games have created some very good world building in the science fiction, and thinking about that ring kind of universe and how we might bring something in from that. It's a very small thing, but I just brought into the collection an Asteroids game cartridge for an early Atari gaming system, part of from a colleague who had worked at Lowell Observatory, and thinking about the depictions and popular understanding of asteroids, which most people envision as the Star Wars, very difficult to maneuver. And of course, astronomers will tell you that's not what an asteroid belt is like at all. So those are some of the newest things that we're thinking about. I think anytime we get a chance to talk to someone who's going into space or has been in space, we start talking to them about not only kind of operationally, what have they done, but kind of personally, what speaks to who they are, how they became an astronaut, and what some of their inspirations have been. And
Mhm.
some of that comes out of these fictional visions.
Right. Well, I can say that I remember playing Asteroids on the Atari when I was a kid. So I love that that's been brought into the collection. It also makes me feel a little bit old, but I think it's great that it's there. Um, so we have many more questions and comments that I wish we had time to address, but thank you so much, Margaret. This was such a fascinating talk. I feel like I learned a lot, and it was really wonderful just to see the chat and how people, thank you, Shannon, for sharing so much great content from Arizona. She was able to share lots of great information about the exhibition and their collections, and I'm so happy to have seen all that, and lots of other good comments. So thank you everyone for being an engaged audience and for sharing your experiences and your questions and thoughts with us. Thank you to all of our 14 affiliate collaborators, to Margaret, and of course to my affiliations colleagues who are mostly behind the scenes making this happen. So we will share the link as soon as we have it posted on our YouTube page, and look forward to seeing everybody again at a future program.
Thank you very much.